winning them over through talking and persuading and consensus building, that's better than neutral aloofness or hiding behind some bureaucratic rules. I have a kind of self-confidence and a certain amount of self-discipline or control that allows me to focus more intellectually rather than emotionally on the issues. Standing by your values is always what you should do, but one has to be pragmatic.
Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom. I'm Erika Eliasson-Norris, and today I'm joined by Professor Tariq Modood, one of Britain's most respected thinkers on diversity, identity and leadership. Tariq, your journey began in the 1980s when Britain looked very different from the country we live in today. What first made you realise that inclusion was not simply a moral issue, but it was a leadership challenge?
When I was a student, this was at Durham University, I was active in the anti-apartheid movement, as you know, quite a lot of students were at the time. And then later, when I was working in Oxford, I was involved in community relations work. The area I lived in had a Pakistani community, and I worked with them and with the Community Relations Council. But I would say that about 1986 it was, that I noticed that there was a public debate, a general debate taking place that was beginning to characterize the country in terms of what I call racial dualism, meaning thinking of the country and its people in terms of black and white. And that wasn't my experience, and it wasn't how I thought of myself. It wasn't at all apparent in the communities that I lived with, worked with, and so on. But it was becoming quite a big issue, mainly on the centre-left, and so the Labour Party got involved and so on. And by the end of that year, 1986, I became an equal opportunities officer in the personnel, or now as we might say, human resources department of the London Borough of Hillingdon. And I began to argue against this idea. I thought that Britain is a much more plural and complex society and can't be reduced to black and white. For instance, and I said that at the time, I didn't think I was black, and I didn't think I was white. So what would this view say about myself? And I began to argue for an alternative view. And I think it's around that time that I realized that I had to get involved in something that required some campaigning, and that I wanted to have some national influence. I wanted to make a difference. And so I set up an organization and wrote to lots of people, some kind of, well-known senior public figures, political figures, others, community activists that I knew and so on. And so, if you like, I started playing a leadership role because I cared about the issues. They were my issues, they were existential to me. I cared about my country and what direction it should go in and shouldn't go in. And I thought that the activists that said it's all about black and white were taking us in the wrong direction. We weren't like the United States, and we shouldn't try to copy that. And so, I guess it's about then that I thought, look, I'm not just an academic or an ex-academic, because I was actually working in local government, that I needed to rise up to what I saw as a political challenge for people like me and for the country as a whole, and began campaigning and both offering certain leadership, obviously at a quite low level, but also writing to, engaging with, trying to meet and influence national leaders, like senior people in the Labour Party and so on, because the Labour Party was probably at the centre of this kind of political contestation.
And looking back to your earlier years, I was listening to an interview that you gave in Canada, actually, and it was talking about your upbringing and how your father influenced some of your kind of formative years. Can you talk a little bit about that? I was really intrigued by the assembly story, for instance.
Yeah, so I don't know how unusual this is. I suppose it's fairly unusual, but not unique. I have come across one or two people who have similar experiences. So my father was a devout Muslim, and he thought that faith and religion and the discipline that religion offers, and especially, I suppose, in growing up, was important. But we came to Britain in 1961, and obviously I went straight to school as 8 at the time. And in my secondary school, there was the possibility of being excused from morning assembly if your parents sent in a note. And the main people who did that were Jewish children. And so I think maybe the school gave me a letter to take to my dad. And I showed it to him, and he looked at it. He said, "What do these children do that don't go into morning assembly?" Which was, a Christian assembly. I said, "Well, some arrive late. There's a special room allocated for them. They sit and chat or read comics or catch up on homework." And he said, "Oh no, you won't be doing any of that." He said, "Go into assembly. Christians more or less believe what we believe. But whenever it is said that Jesus is the Son of God, without making any kind of fuss, just quietly say to yourself, no, he's not. But otherwise, join in all the worship." And indeed, I did very enthusiastically and over all the years. And by the time I was in my sixth form, I was one of the leading readers of what you might call the lesson. I used to pick things and read things from, say, the Old Testament, sometimes the New Testament as well, because I don't know how many people are aware of this, but Jesus is one of the most important prophets of Islam. And I organized the carol singing in the streets at Christmas to raise money for charity. And so my dad had this very unusual view that, if you like, putting it very simply, some religion is better than none. But more sophisticatedly than that, he had a sense of Islam and Christianity being very close religions with certain theological differences. But the theological differences didn't mean that we didn't share not only a lot of beliefs in common, but a lot of values, like respect for people, compassion for people worse off than ourselves, social justice, equality, and individual freedom of conscience, and so on. So, it was quite interesting for me that I was brought up with a kind of a Muslim home background, but quite steeped in school Christianity.
Mm. And looking back, what did you learn about helping people feel that they belong? And how do you think leaders today can help build that sense, particularly in the tough times that we're in?
I suppose as a child, I was given a sense at home that we are somebody. We have an identity. We're not just anybody. So we came from Pakistan, and we were Muslims. And these were identities that were very important to my dad. The reason I keep emphasizing my dad is because very, very unusually, it was my dad that brought us up. My parents divorced, and it was my dad that brought us up. So actually, this is in the 1960s. This is an absolute statistical freak that I was brought up by a single parent who was an Asian Muslim man. And so we were brought up with that sense of identity, that we shouldn't allow people to insult or rob us of that identity. But at the same time, my dad wanted us to learn everything that we could about, well, from school and life in Britain and through friends and so on, and television. I think television is one of the biggest sources of learning for us as children, and where I think I got my English accent. And the other thing, so that was home, but more than that, as a child, all children want to belong. They don't like to be pushed out of groups and left marginal, left friendless. And so, of course, I wanted that. But I also wanted, which again I don't think is unique to me, a sense of belonging to the country in which I was now setting down roots. And so I think a sense of being British and being accepted as British goes quite a long way back from me to my childhood and certainly my teenage years. And I used to find it very odd because the kinds of person I was, the kinds of issues I was involved in, and I got very interested in politics at a very early age. And this was, very much left of centre politics. I was always kind of surprised and disappointed that people on the left in the 60s, 70s, 80s always kind of ran down the idea of Britain and people having pride in Britain. And I could see this wasn't true for other countries, certainly wasn't true for France or the United States or Pakistan for that matter. And yet, there is a burden of history, a burden of historical guilt as well as historical pride. And I think that the left in those days, and I'd say that to them, had an unbalanced view about Britain, and they had a very superficial view about belonging. They all did feel British in an important way, and certainly other people looking at them would say, well, you're very British. But they thought the best way of expressing national pride was to not talk about it, that it should be unstated, it should be implicit, and we shouldn't have flag waving and so on. And I thought that wasn't good enough, especially as when in the 1970s we saw the rise of groups like the National Front that were marching down our streets, waving the Union Jack. And I thought, well, no, that's my flag. We should stand up for that flag. Whereas a lot of the protesters and the demonstrators, and I went to some of these protests and demonstrations, their view was no one should be flying this flag, that there was something slightly dirty about this flag. And I said, well, no, we have to stop them flying our flag. We have to own it and, as it were, win it from them. And I found myself, in a very small minority holding that view of any colour or background, till finally I began to get some resonance in the 1990s. I think one of the first major figures who began to think like I did, in a public way, was Tony Blair. And he said no, he wanted a Labour Party, which of course he transformed, called it New Labour and so on, but he wanted to be a patriotic party that wasn't ashamed of its flags, other symbols, and of history. There are things in British history that we should critically examine. And of course, people like me, who were, as it were, at the rough end, at the bottom end of the British imperial history and experience, want that examined. But it doesn't mean that I want to throw away the idea of being British, because I feel I became part of the British story when the British came to India, and made some Indians as much like the British as possible, at least in certain ways. And so I think we need to think a lot more about British imperial history rather than dismiss it or pretend it never happened and just be focused on the island story or Europe or whatever. And so, so I think those kinds of currents of belonging, both in terms of home and community identity, but also in terms of national inclusion, active national inclusion, not just waiting for it to happen passively, and certainly not allowing the divisive figures to wave our flag as if they had a bigger right to it than we do.
It's really interesting. And obviously it's quite topical at the moment as
Certainly
well.
is.
When we talk about leadership and we talk about influence or strategy, sometimes there can be opposing views, but showing that respect for all different perspectives is something that is probably one of the hardest tests, I think, of leadership or of leaders in organisations today. You've challenged both sides of the debate over the years, and I'm just interested to hear from you on what do you think the personal cost is of standing in one camp as opposed to another, and how do you stay grounded in those particular values? If you were a leader in an organisation, you obviously have your own views, but then the organisation has their own potential views, or they want to be apolitical or whatever themselves. How do you manage that? Because you've been there, you've experienced it.
Yes, you are right. I have had to stand up for unpopular things, unpopular in the group I belong to, as it were, that I'm, institutionally part of, working with, and so on. So, I mean, when I was an anti-apartheid activist at Durham University, there'd be people who'd be jeering and so on. But I think but that was more at the mass, like a demonstration. I think the first time I began to experience some hostility aimed at me personally, because I was arguing for something personally, probably goes back to when I said to you that I became kind of politically energized, and the thought that I had to myself even set up an organization and try and influence things nationally, when I opposed the idea of racial dualism, a kind of black-white dualism. So I was working in Hillingdon, London Borough, as an equal opportunities officer, and meeting others who were working in the same position in other London boroughs. And also just in my own organisation, there were people who were very committed to anti-racism, which was a good thing. But unfortunately, quite a lot of people saw their anti-racism in exactly this kind of black-white ways that I was opposing. And so they'd get quite annoyed with me and say how divisive I was. So that kind of began then. And perhaps one of the most extreme cases was at the time of the Muslim anger against Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses. And obviously There's a big controversy, battle, and even an international crisis with the leader of Iran intervening and so on. And I thought, and you mentioned my dad's influence, so I was, caught up with this, obviously, as someone working in equality issues at the time. But I thought, well, should we really be fighting about a novel? And so I said to my dad, what do you think? And he was crying just thinking about it and so on. And I realized then that if my dad could feel this, that this was going to be a big issue. It wasn't going to be something that will just blow away. And it was going to actually be a feature, in some ways, mark Muslim British society relations. And he said, you are very lucky. You are privileged to have had a high level of education. I had a PhD. You speak well, and you seem to have acquired a confidence to speak in public and say unpopular things. You should use your talents and opportunities to help British society understand why Muslims are angry, but more generally understand Muslims. And you should help Muslims understand why British society thinks about their behavior as it does, or other features. And, you are very well suited to be this cross-cultural figure, a bridge-building figure. And I must say, so that would have been 1980, early 1980. And 90. That's right. The book came out in 1989. And I must say that I took that on board and did participate quite publicly in discussions about the Satanic verses, trying to argue a very unpopular middle position, saying that Muslims had a grievance and we should hear it without necessarily agreeing to it. We should engage in dialogue with it rather than dismiss it as saying, oh, they're all backward, they don't know how to read a novel, they're illiterate, they're religious fanatics. And on the other hand, we obviously should protect the author, we should protect the life of the author, we should be seriously committed to intellectual freedoms. But quite a lot of people, including some friends, thought I was being far too sympathetic to the fundamentalists.
Right.
And I lost friendships. So, yeah, there are personal costs.
How did that make you feel? Because that was your view, your perspective, which is as valid as anybody else's, whether it contradicts or doesn't. How do you deal with that? Because that's personal.
Yeah. So how do I deal with it? I mean, first of all, of course, it hurts. I don't like it. There are people I don't want to lose as friends, people I like, people I've thought of as friends. Sometimes they just say it to your face, and sometimes you can just feel a new coldness has entered a relationship. They don't get in touch with you, for instance. They don't invite you to certain things. And even when I became a professor of sociology, a lot of people thought, oh, going on about ethnicity and above all going on about religious minorities, that's so superficial, and big issues are all to do with class and gender. Why are you going on about these minor, marginal issues? And the sociology tradition is actually a tradition based around socioeconomic structures. So to talk about people's identities and people's cultures is quite dominant in British sociology now. But when I started, say, in the 1990s, it was quite marginal. But luckily, anti-racism and gender equality issues had become quite important in British sociology. So I could kind of show what I was doing by relating it to those issues. But to answer your question about how do I deal with it? I'm kind of struggling to answer it because I don't know whether I have a particular formula or way of dealing with it. I would say that I have a kind of self-confidence and a certain amount of self-discipline or control, self-control, that's probably the right word, that allows me to focus more intellectually rather than emotionally on the issues. So one of the things that my wife says to me is that when I'm on a program, like say Newsnight or a studio debate, defending my point of view, she says, you always stay calm when the other side gets angry and starts losing their temper. You never reply in kind. You're always still dissecting their arguments and telling them, for instance, that it's not consistent. They started off saying one thing and are now saying another, and so on. And I said, yeah, I kind of feel that's not good on TV. And she said, no. I mean, she may be right or wrong, but she said, no. Most people watching will say, oh, this man's worth listening to because he's carrying on talking calmly and coherently when other people are just getting aggressive. So I guess it's just a certain kind of mix between self-confidence and self-control and just carrying on under fire.
It sounds like you're quite reflective in the moment. I presume that comes from your upbringing and your father.
Yeah, and I think it comes also actually from, being a migrant, because when you're an outsider of any kind, and I think this applies especially, of course, to children and young people, you work harder to make sure that you're not upsetting people and make sure that you're not doing anything that will make you stick out as, oh, what's wrong with him? So I suspect, and also I said to you that I was brought up by just my dad, and so I lost my mum, through a divorce. I lost my mum at a very early age, and I think that also leads to a certain kind of toughening up. And so I kind of learned self-control at a very early age, both in personal context, but then as I became more involved in public things, I just took it into that level as well.
And boards often try to stay neutral when the pressure builds, when things go wrong, or when the organisation doesn't potentially perform or act in a way that they should do. But sometimes that neutrality can look like or feel like avoidance of whatever that particular issue is. Do you think that, from your experience, that playing it safe is potentially a failure of leadership in that sort of situation? Should people be standing by their principles and their values, or is the neutral approach sometimes the best option?
I think standing by your values is always what you should do. But one has to be pragmatic. So standing by your values can be done in a inflexible way, and it can be done in a more kind of contextual way and in a more consensual way, i.e. carrying people with you, explaining yourself and explaining why you think certain things need to be done. But also, I mean, I imagine, management is a little bit different to life at a university or in public debates and so on, but trying to be dialogical. So not just saying, sticking by your values doesn't mean I've made a decision, I'm now telling you, and it's got to be done. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't some contexts where we don't do this, and as I say, I might not fully understand how some business organizations work. But I think drawing people into a values-based dialogue and explaining, but also asking them, what they think, and winning them over through talking and persuading and consensus building, I think that's better than a kind of neutral aloofness or hiding behind some bureaucratic rules. So, I mean, as you can see from the story I'm telling about myself and perhaps my demeanor, I'm not a kind of gung-ho person, like, calling things out and denouncing people and exposing people and firing people and cancelling people and so on. I think that generates quite a lot of counterproductive responses. So I very much, following up what my dad said in 1980 about being dialogical and carrying people with you, but recognizing that there are victims. Because I could see in the Satanic Verses affair that Muslims were really upset and were not being treated at all respectfully. And as I said to you earlier, I mean, my dad was crying when he was talking to me about this. Now, it may be that there were levels of misunderstanding, that people had taken offense from a novel and perhaps, they shouldn't have done, and that other people, what you might call certain kinds of activists or propagandists, had exaggerated certain things for effect. But that always happens in politics and life. That wasn't by any means unique to that controversy or to Muslims. But nevertheless, I think that trying to have what I would call sensible but sensitive dialogues, so you are trying to be sensitive to other people's feelings, even where you don't agree, and even where you're going to ultimately have to say to them that you don't agree and you recommend some other way. So whether that works in all business organizations, a university is one place it can work. And though I think actually universities are becoming far too managerial over the last couple of decades, they really have. And you may say, well, how can we have a public debate with, very right-wing people, or for that matter, very left-wing people, when they're kind of shouting, and we see how terrible social media has become. I mean, it's destroying the idea of dialogue because it's just a matter of aggression and abuse and denouncing people and trying to big up your own side and undermine other people or the other side. So I think social media has done a lot of harm to our public conversations. And I'm now seeing public expressions of racism that I last saw in the 1970s. It's absolutely amazing. We've gone so backward because as a country, we had actually been making fairly good progress. Certainly if we compare ourselves to our neighbouring countries, for instance. But I think in general, we obviously hadn't done everything right and there was more to do and we could have even done more. But nevertheless, I think we were moving in a racial, egalitarian, multicultural direction. And yes, to some extent, there will be a backlash because people have an alternative view. But the form that it's currently taking in Britain, much of it leaking out, as it were, from the social media and all the misinformation campaigns that are leading to anxiety and alarm and confrontation in the streets and shouting and flag waving in completely the wrong way, divisive flag waving rather than unifying flag waving. I think social media has a lot to answer for. And so I find my engagement in social media is becoming less and less because it's not a place for dialogue and learning about what other people think and widening your sensibilities. It's just the opposite. It's narrowing you down into, well, I must stand up for this because I'm being attacked just on this.
Do you think that some of that is to do with how faceless social media can be? So you're behind a computer screen, behind a phone, in the security of your home or wherever else you might be, and you don't see that as another person that you're really interacting with. You just send a message out. And whereas if that was a face-to-face conversation, I think potentially people wouldn't act or say some of the things that they say.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, Erika. People act on social media with a rudeness and an abruptness that they wouldn't in an ordinary human interaction, in a conversation. It's like people say, a person behind the wheel of a car becomes a very different person to the person that you knew when you were. My wife, for instance, she says, you're so, calm and well-mannered, but when you're driving, you become a totally different person. I don't agree with her, but she seems to notice it. And this point about social media is made worse by the fact that you can be anonymous. I think that's so poisonous. Some of the worst excesses are coming from anonymous accounts or fake accounts, people pretending to be people that they're not. And of course, the worst cases are those that then lead to, sexual grooming and sexual abuses and probably also frauds and scams and so on. But even in public conversations, public debates, I think there are quite a lot of accounts where people are pretending to be people they're not, so they can put forward a view that will, to some extent, look as a bit more acceptable, because they'll put forward a view from, as it were, a victim's point of view when they really aren't a victim at all. They're probably, a middle-aged white man pretending to be a young woman or a young black person or something. So social media, there's so many advantages to internet and the advance of our technologies, but social media really is quite not even mixed now. At the moment, I think it's more of a curse than a blessing.
And boards today, they face a real tension between inclusion and clarity, and they often want to hear every voice to take into account what that is. But by doing that, potentially they don't stand for anything in particular. When do you think that trying to represent every viewpoint it waters down an organisation potentially? But do you think that there's any, positivity that comes out of that? Or do you think that standing for something and having those values and a particular perspective on something is really important?
So I said to you before that I thought standing for your values or for an institution's values is important. And sometimes if we don't consciously think about that, we can lose our way and find ourselves in a position we wouldn't have wished to be in, letting down some employees, for instance, or damaging public reputation. But we do need to be more aware of diversity of views and diversity of sensibilities. People don't all react in the same way. And I know businesses and so on obviously do a lot of market research, before they bring a product to market, or to find out why people aren't buying something, or would they like it more if it was packaged in a different way, called something else, or associated with a personality and so on. So I do think there's something right in that strategy, which means trying to find out what people think and how they react to certain stimuli, whether it's to do with packaging or to do with a slogan, to sell a product and so on. So I would say, let's take that further, and especially not just for market research, but in one's own organization, and find out what people think, especially people who are relatively marginal, people who don't normally get a chance to speak or be heard apart from in, small conversations in the corner. So, yeah, we do need a little bit more active viewpoint diversity, identifying and bringing that into the center. But that's not the opposite of standing for your values. That should be one of your values.
That's really interesting. And final question from me. I see culture within organizations as a really early warning sign of systems that are about to fail. So it allows you to see what's working. It also allows you to see potentially what's about to break long before the headlines kind of reach that organization. And if culture is part of governance, what signs do you think directors or people that work in organizations can watch out for to notice that potentially people like you, that would be in organizations, there may be issues, there may be challenges in that culture way before the headlines hit? I think that would be really interesting for the people that are listening and watching.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that what I will say is probably even less knowledgeable than the people watching, but I'll have a go. I mean, demoralization. If people don't seem to be as enthusiastic as they used to be, or as that you wish them to be, or that there's a particular set of tasks that they don't seem to relish. Obviously, you'd want to know why suddenly people are getting demoralized. And I mean, in the extreme case where a certain amount of absenteeism becomes apparent, you think, well, gosh, not everybody can have this stomach bug. I mean, what's happening? Possibly also if the workforce is breaking up into cliques, some people not wanting to talk to other people and some people only thinking these are my buddies. That's obviously a sign that any manager would have to pick up and find out more and do something about. And it may be that they're part of the problem because they're implementing a policy or implementing a policy in the wrong way, badly, and so on. So it's not just, there's a problem with the employees, because the manager is part of that situation, part of that structure. So that's what they have to identify. What's happening here? What's the source? And in a way, if you had a culture that did those things, that would be heading off some of the problems. There will always be problems. We're not talking about perfect organizations or a perfect society. There will always be problems. So what you need are people who are encouraged to have some antennae for picking up where something is not working, and especially is not working because some people feel their views are not being taken into account, or their experience, or their expertise, or their loyalty to the organization. So that kind of dissatisfaction, I think any good manager would have to pick that up. And I hope they do. I hope that's what they're taught to do. I feel very amateurish, because I'm very lucky. I work with very small research teams, and so those things are much easier to pick up than someone who's in charge of quite a lot of people. One thing I will say about an aspect of culture would be careful about a certain kind of self-congratulation. So I'll mention an example because it's one that everyone will be able to pick up, but it's not to do with business. So like many people, I'm a great admirer of Gareth Southgate, a former England football manager, who I think as an individual and as a England manager is a very admirable person. And he said, I want a team that reflects the country. And many people, including me, said, yes, that's laudable, that's good, that's what you should be doing, and so on. And he was very, very caring about his players, and especially black players who were abused, and so on. But the point I'm really getting at is many people said to him, and he came to think himself, that he was achieving this goal of having a country that reflected the country. And the term sometimes he used was that he wanted a diverse team. But the team was just black and white. It clearly was not diverse. And I'm not saying Gareth Southgate was to blame for this. I mean, these would be big structural issues, where players are coming from and what level they've got to, etc. So I'm not saying that there's a simple solution and that he was in any sense leaving people out that he should be including. I mean, it's not as simple as that. But nevertheless, he and everybody, was congratulating him for having achieved a diverse team, and therefore they were blind to something. And I think, sometimes self-congratulation is a good thing, especially if it's a team effort. You're not congratulating yourself as an individual, you're congratulating your team. But be careful of the blind spots that we all have, and that we can talk up one particular thing up to a certain level, not realizing that actually we're being blind to the limitations of what we've achieved. And therefore we should be careful about celebrating it, or the celebration should go hand in hand with trying to identify and address the limitations.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for joining me today in Grit in the Boardroom.
Thank you, Erika.
I think the conversation with Tariq today was really interesting. He had a number of points to raise about where he'd had to stand in the face of adversity. He'd also had to face into friendship losses and other relationship breakdowns as a result of his own values and his own views and perspectives, which was definitely something that leaders face quite often. There was also a conversation about faceless social media, and we spoke a bit about what that was like and why people feel that they can air their perspectives, judgments, views potentially more openly than they would do face to face. And I think it was telling that he said that it brought back some memories for him of what it was like at the beginning of his career, with some of the interactions that he sees on social media now. And he thought that the world and England, Britain had moved on since then, and potentially it hasn't. At least social media potentially has brought some of that back. And finally, the self-congratulatory piece that he brought out about Gareth Southgate, that was really interesting in terms of the perspective that people have on that approach to saying well done for what we've achieved. Because the reality is that the people that are in society at large may well not feel that that particular perspective has been taken into account. They might feel that whatever changes are suggested haven't actually been adjusted or changed enough for them and for their own personality fit. I know it's something that Tariq mentioned about the fact that there were white and black people on the team, but that was it, and that was seen to be a win. And of course it is to a certain extent, but if you don't see someone that looks like you in those particular roles or situations, then it can be quite alienating and ostracising for those particular individuals. So a note to leadership to think about what it means when you are saying well done and patting yourself or the organisation on the back for doing a job well done. Is it really a job well done in the eyes of other people outside the organisation and perhaps people from different ethnic backgrounds? That's it for this episode of Grit in the Boardroom. Thank you to Tariq for sharing his story with honesty and insight, and thank you for listening.